A reading from the book of Psalms. Hear what God's Spirit is saying to you. Oh, come, let us sing to the Lord. Let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation. Let us come into his presence with thanksgiving. Let us make a joyful noise to him with songs of praise. For the Lord is a great God, and a great God above all gods. In his hands are the depths of the earth. The heights of the mountains are also his. The sea is his, for he made it, and the dry land which his hands have formed. Oh, come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord, our Maker. For he is our God, and we are the people of his pasture, and the sheep of his hands. Oh, that today you would listen to his voice. Here ends the reading of the words that give us insight to God. And may God grant us the wisdom and courage for interpretation.
I love the scripture about giving thanks to God and coming together in praise and thanksgiving, especially this Sunday, as we've been talking a lot about giving thanks and gratitude. And of course, when we come together, we always strive to come in gratitude for God's presence in our lives and to praise God. We also come every Sunday, I think, with things on our hearts, desires to know more about God, more about the text that unites us. And so I thought one thing that might be kind of fun, since we've been gifted an extra Sunday this year, a rare Sunday between Thanksgiving and Advent, to do something a little bit different today that I'm calling questions and not answers, but perspectives, a little Q and P. And so the way that this is going to work is I'm going to ask you to think about some questions that you might like to ask. And in just a moment, you can raise your hand, and my lovely assistant, Maggie Broderick, will come around with a handheld mic, and you can ask a question, and I will give you my perspective on that question, knowing that as progressive Christians, we recognize there is often no one right answer. Let me set up a couple of boundaries here. Don't ask me like specific verses, like if you say, Caleb, what does Romans 13 verse 5 say? I'm not going to know. Okay, I'm not that type of pastor. I'm not going to know that. But if you have something, and also it's going to be hard if you have a specific verse that you want to ask a question about without reading the context, and that's going to be hard to do. But if you just want to ask some general theological questions or things that you've always wondered about, that's a good thing to do during this time. So, who has a question? Right over here. Oh, okay. And then Floyd.
Would you say Jesus had a temper?
I think, would I say that Jesus had a temper? So I think Jesus practiced an extraordinary amount of patience considering the situation that he was in. And so Jesus had a lot of gripes with the society around him because Jesus was a Middle Eastern Jewish peasant, right? Not as America has made him, blonde-haired, blue-eyed, white Jesus. That Jesus did not exist. Jesus was a brown-skinned, Middle Eastern Jewish peasant who was living under the thumb of the Roman Empire. Okay, so his people were oppressed. And on top of that, there was this strict purity system in his society that divided people into classes. I've talked about that a couple of times over the past couple of months. And so Jesus recognized the injustice in his society, and he tried to teach people an alternative way of living. But I think he had some righteous anger about all of that. Right? He was angry at the injustice in his world, and he was angry that that manifested in such a way that his people were oppressed, and the people who were the most marginalized in society, that they were the people who it seemed like had the least opportunities in society. And so Jesus spent much of his ministry around those kinds of people, the people who were on the margins. And he was motivated, I believe, by that righteous anger, motivated to confront oppression. And so obviously the place where we see that the clearest, I think, is during Holy Week, whenever Jesus goes into the temple. And the thing to recognize about this moment when Jesus goes into the temple and overturns the money changers' tables is that this was something that was planned. Okay, he on Sunday, on what we now call Palm Sunday, he stages this political protest where he is going into Jerusalem in the same manner that Pontius Pilate is coming in, and he sets himself up in contrast to Pontius Pilate, the reign of God, the basileia of God, in contrast to the Roman Empire, the basileia of God that creates peace through justice, not peace through violence and conflict and conquering. And then he goes later in the week to the temple and confronts the purity system. And he does that by overturning the money changers' tables. And I think it was righteous anger that inspired that. I don't think those moments where we see Jesus in film with like a whip going through the temple and like in a rage of like throwing everything over because he just has had it. I'm not sure that that's accurate. I think it's much more likely that Jesus was righteously angry and had planned this demonstration in the temple as a protest against the purity system and because the reason people bought things sacrifices at the temple from the money changers is so that they could go and be more pure before God. That was the whole purpose of them being there. So I think that it was righteous anger. Did he get angry at other stuff in life? I'm sure he did. But I think that righteous anger was a part of his ministry, a vital part of his ministry.
Well, I got two questions.
2 for 1.
The first is Christ's birth. Mm-hmm. It's not on the 25th. So why do we as Christians accept that, and also with this pagan Christmas?
Yeah.
Can you explain why we accept that?
Yeah, so we have absolutely no idea when Jesus was born. No idea. There are no records of that. There's no mention of that in the text at all. Scholars think he was probably born around 4 before the Common Era, so not like in the year 1 AD, but a few years before that, because of the mention of Herod in the text, because that's when he died. That's the year that he died. So that's the kind of the latest that Jesus could have been born and still been born under Herod's reign. So we have no idea when he was born. The reason that it is December 25th is because that is around the winter solstice and Saturnalia. And so there was a Roman god who was celebrated during that time, and it was an effort to kind of take that celebration in the culture and reform it to be about Jesus. So we'll talk more about ways that early Christians tried to do that. So on the 4th Sunday of Advent, we're going to be looking throughout Advent at various narratives, birth narratives of Jesus. And on the 4th Sunday, we're going to talk about a Roman narrative that's in the text. And so this will be a fun challenge if you don't know where it is. There's another birth narrative elsewhere in the text that's not in one of the Gospels about Jesus that is a Roman narrative that early Christians took and made about Jesus. So it's in December, around December 25th, because of the winter solstice. Yeah.
Would you ever preach on the book of Enoch?
Sure. I would, yeah. So nothing, you know how it is around here. Not much is off limits. So, yeah. He asked if I would ever preach on the book of Enoch. And I said, sure.
Hi, Caleb.
Yeah.
In case you don't want to answer this, you're quite welcome to pass the mic. How do I deal with the absolute fear and hatred, and I just want to pull my pink Uzi out and in this political situation in our country.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. I wish there were easy answers for this, but I think this is one of the most, I won't pass because I think it's one of the most pressing issues of our time, right? We are living in a highly polarized time and world. And we are living in a time when it is hard to see nuances, right? But most of life is nuanced. And we have really tended to other people. And there are a lot of reasons for that, including, polarization of the media, I think, including our increasing disconnectedness from other people. And I think in some ways, social media helps with that. In other ways, it really allows us to speak it just to our own echo chambers. And so I think finding the patience to deal with all of that is tough. I think one of the things that we can do is to recognize the things that we can change and also the things that are ultimately out of our control. Because it is real easy to get upset about the state of the world. It is real easy to look at things that are going on in the world and to want to take a personal responsibility to change stuff and to make it better. And yet also, global policy is something that's out of our control. The polarization of society is something that we can only affect in small little ways. And so I can't tell you the answer for how you find the patience and all, but I can tell you what helps me. And it is practicing communities like this, right? I think real lived communities are important because real lived communities teach us not just to theoretically accept other people, but to actually accept other people. So my doctoral dissertation was on social media and how churches engage in online spaces, right? And I wrote this pre-pandemic. But one of the things that I said was that digital community is important and necessary, and also not the same as real community, because there's something that happens when you sit down next to somebody and you talk to them and you communicate with them and you accept them that doesn't happen in other spaces. And there aren't a lot of spaces where different types of people come together and make a commitment to be in community together. So what helps me is church and other intentional communities where we make a commitment to stay together, to try to accept each other, to work through differences, and to try to stay in community together. And when you practice that on a regular basis, I think that makes a big difference. So that's at least something that helps me. Other questions? Yeah, Maggie, back here, Jeff.
I've been watching a series called The Chosen, and I'm just wondering if that's a pretty good representation of Jesus Christ.
I haven't watched it, so I can't say. I'm sorry. Yeah, I often keep up with shows and media, but I haven't watched that. So,
what other religions influence this church, and which tradition is your favorite?
So my first degree, I have four theological degrees, and my first degree is in religious studies from a secular religious studies program. And so I did a lot of comparative religion study, which means that I love other religious traditions. It is something that I have always found fascinating. And so my wife also was a religious studies major. And so probably our house is one of the few Protestant ministers' house where you can go and see Hindu gods around the house, because we love comparative religion kind of stuff and think that it's fascinating. So I think that, as a church, one of the things that we try to do is to say that we are open to multiple paths to God while recognizing that the path that we are following as a community is the path taught to us by Jesus, right? That there are multiple ways to see the world, but the window through which, at least as a community, we try to see the world is the window through which Jesus gave us, the teachings of Jesus. But I think for me personally, there have been a lot of other traditions that have helped to influence my faith and to make it stronger. So last week, I think, as folks were leaving, I'm trying to remember who it was that we were speaking about Buddhism. And I think that Buddhism is one of the traditions that has helped me to become a better Christian through recognizing the fleetingness of moments, through recognizing the moment we're in. That's a real spiritual practice and something that society doesn't really teach us. And so feeling grounded in the moment, I think, is something that I've learned through Buddhism and something that I appreciate, as well as meditative practice and centering, that I don't think is incompatible with Christianity. I think that it's something that can strengthen Christianity. Another religious tradition that has greatly influenced my own thought process is Taoism. And in Taoism, we talk about how there is a way, a natural way of life that kind of flows through life. And a lot of times in life, we find ourselves like fighting against the current. And Taoists kind of believe that there are things in our lives that if we are open to them, that if we are receptive to them, that can influence kind of how we live our lives. And that's influenced one of the ways that I think about God. And so I often kind of think about God as this force that permeates our lives, that if we are open to it, can influence how it is that we live. So I had a campus minister friend who would always say, God doesn't control our lives, but God participates in our lives. Right? So I'm not one who believes in like just a distant God, like deists might, like a clockmaker God. Have you heard that? Deism was something that was very popular at the founding of the nation. And so they believe that kind of God set things into motion and then just step back. I don't really believe in that kind of God. I believe in a God who is at work in our lives, who's a part of everything that we do. And if we open ourselves up to that, then that can influence our lives. So those are two traditions that have influenced the way that I think theologically about God. But of course, one of the things that we try to do here is to say, and there's nothing wrong with learning about other traditions. And if things are helpful for you to make sense of your life, then embrace them. And if they're not, then cut them. As long as they're ultimately life-giving, that's one of the things that we're striving to do here.
One of the first things God did was create the heavens and earth and everything on it and in it. How do you believe God feels we are taking care of what he gave us, the blessing that he gave us? And also, is there theology that believes the sooner we use up this earth, the sooner Jesus will come back?
That's a great question. So, Christians have a really bad history of caring for the earth. So I took this class in seminary called World Religions and Ecology, and we talked about different religions and how they cared for the earth. And one of the things that I learned very quickly was that Christianity is one of the worst about actually caring for the earth. And yes, there are verses in Genesis that people have misconstrued to justify exploitation of the earth. So there is in those creation stories, and if you're curious more about this, you should go to Steve Mather's class on Tuesday. I bet this is one of the things that you all might talk about. That human beings are created and given dominion over the earth. And so some people have thought that means that we can do whatever we want to the earth. And moreover, to Jeff's point, that if we actively destroy the earth, it will hasten the eschaton. It will create the end times so that Jesus can come on back and we can get to life after the destruction of the world, after the apocalypse. So I think that's deeply problematic theology. One, because it's not really based on any teachings of Jesus. It is based on, people putting their own interpretations on Jesus and on the text. But certainly because in those creation stories, we see that the earth, that all that we have, are gifts from God. A lot of times people will focus on the second creation story. There are two. The second creation story where Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden, and they'll latch on to Augustine's notion of original sin. But the first creation story is one where we don't get an original sin, but we get original blessing. And God creates everything, and after everything God creates, calls it good, and calls us good. And so I think we get a much stronger theology if we care for the earth that God has created and called good. So yes, combat the bad theology of hastening the eschaton by destroying the earth. Not a good idea. Not a great idea.
Hi, Caleb.
Hi.
My parents lately have been telling me that they're very concerned about the church that I go to and the path that I'm going down, and that they're concerned about my eternal future.
Yeah.
What would you say to people like that when our church is so different from other churches?
Yeah, that's a great question. So people online frequently say similar things to me, and I think people have a lot of baggage around theology, a lot of baggage. And we call this like inherited theology or embedded theology, and that's the stuff that you learn from the time you're itty-bitty, and you just kind of accept because someone has told it to you. And it is hard to break down some of that stuff, and some people are never able to get rid of that stuff. But the problem is that most of that stuff that is inherited and embedded isn't authentic to Jesus. It's not what the real Jesus, the historical Jesus, actually taught. A lot of the theology that we grow up around in American Christianity is stuff that people just made up over the years and isn't authentic to Jesus. Jesus' whole ministry was about breaking down barriers and fighting for justice for people who are on the margins. That's what his ministry was about. And whenever he died, people forgot all that and just started worshiping Jesus. And there's nothing wrong, I don't think, with having what we would call a higher Christology, right? Which is, say, believing that Jesus is a part of the Trinity. Or not. I don't think there's a right or a wrong in that. I tend not to believe that Jesus is divine, and I tend not to be Trinitarian, but some people are, and that's fine. Because I think that doesn't really matter at the end of the day. What matters is how we live our lives. But I think where it becomes problematic is when people think that all we have to do to be Christian is confess the right thing about Jesus, believe in Jesus, and then do nothing else. So I think, you got to live in the way that's right to you. You got to live in an authentic way to yourself. And ultimately, if people don't accept that, that's kind of their problem. If people can't accept you, that's their own problem. And so I think we've just got to live our own authentic lives and follow the journey that's right for us. And you can take comfort in knowing that your faith is built on a more historically grounded, probably more accurate theology. Yeah. And I'll take maybe one more question because I'm seeing we're after 11 and I'll just stand up here and talk all day. Yeah.
Hi, Caleb. I think you implied it when you spoke about Buddhism and Taoism.
Yeah.
Do you personally believe or regard Jesus as a spirit person?
This is a very great tie-in to the Marcus Borg book that we just read. So our small groups were reading this book called Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time. To piggyback onto what I was just saying, we have this American notion of Christianity that portrays Jesus in such a way that really probably isn't who Jesus actually was. And so through breaking this all down, Borg says that when we meet the real Jesus, the historical Jesus who actually lived, it's like meeting him for the first time. So you're meeting Jesus again for the first time. And one of the things that Borg argues in the book is that throughout history, there have been a series of people who were so in touch with the divine, what we might call God, or what other traditions might call something else. But the source beyond us, this great mystery, there are some people who are so in touch with that their lives are virtually indistinguishable from that which is divine. And so he calls these people spirit people. And so some of those people might be people like Lao Tzu, who wrote the Tao Te Ching, or like Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, or like Jesus, or like Muhammad. People whose lives are influential and who help us to understand God in a different way. And so I think that, yes, in that is more the way that I see Jesus, as the person who has been the best mediator of the divine for me. Or John Dominic Crossan, historical Jesus scholar, put it like this. He said, if you want to know what God looks like in sandals, you point to Jesus, right? What God looks like as a human being, not saying that I think that Jesus was God, because I don't actually think that Jesus taught that. I think that people said that about Jesus. But whenever we want to see someone who lived their lives so filled with the divine presence that it influenced everything they said and did, it's Jesus. And so that's why Jesus continues to be the best teacher about God for me, and why I consider myself a Christian and a Jesus follower, because Jesus was so filled with that divine spirit that it influenced the way that he lived his whole life. And so that inspires me to try and live my life in that way as well. So again, these aren't necessarily answers. These are just one guy's perspectives. And one of the things that I love about this church is, you know what? You don't have to agree with me. You can say, well, that was kind of interesting, Caleb, on that one thing. Another thing you got completely wrong. And that's fine. That's fine. I love it when people come up to me and say, wait, I don't have to agree with you? No, you don't. That's one of the things that we do at this church. We have in our traditions what we call not a freedom of belief. Because sometimes people say that. Well, we can believe whatever we want in this tradition. That's not actually true. We have a responsible freedom of belief. And that word responsible is important because what it means is that we have to be intellectually honest, and we have to be respectful of one another, and we have to hear each other out and listen. And so one of the things that I love most about this community is a willingness to embrace a responsible freedom of belief. So thanks for letting me do questions and perspectives. I appreciate that. I always like to do that online, and it's fun to do it in person as well.